Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for sticking around for the last panel of a very full, exciting, and informative day. Hopefully we can keep you engaged through this last panel. My name is Tiffany George. I am an attorney at the Federal Trade Commission in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection. With me is my colleague, Katie Worthman, who's an attorney in our Division of Financial Practices, and together we will be co-moderating this panel. Before I introduce our esteemed speakers, I'd like to remind everyone that we have staff in the audience who have comment cards. If you have questions, we plan to make this interactive, make it a conversation more than a presentation, and we will welcome your questions and comments throughout the panel, and we'll take them as they come. So first, let me introduce our esteemed panelists who have been so gracious to share their time with us today. To my immediate left is Ryan Kalo, who is a professor at the University of Washington School of Law. To his left is Fred Kate, who's Senior Policy Advisor for the Center for Information Policy Leadership and a professor at the Indiana University School of Law. To his left is Jeremy Jalula, who is the Tech Policy Director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And to his left is Irene Liu, General Counsel of Checker. And at the far end, last but certainly not least, is Marianela Lopez-Galdos, who is Director of Competition and Regulatory Policy at the Computer and Communications Industry Association. So welcome and thank you. So throughout the day, we've obviously been talking about algorithms, artificial intelligence, and predictive analytics. And the last panel talked about ethical issues on those topics. In this panel, we like to drill down even more and talk about the natural outgrowth of those ethical issues, which are the consumer protection implications for AI. And with that, I'd like to open up to the panel to drill down into what are the consumer protection implications.
Should I start?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and really admiring of the Federal Trade Commission's commitment to keep abreast of emerging technology and your leadership role in that. One of the innovations of the FTC has been to bring on technical staff very early so that they can actually understand the technologies that they regulate. So, I mean, from a consumer perspective standpoint, there are three, I think, puzzles that I worry about, and they're each about line drawing, I guess you could say. And the first is does there come a point where by using machine learning, other techniques of artificial intelligence, that companies have such a great information and power asymmetry over consumers that we worry about advantage taking. For example, the Federal Trade Commission passed the door-to-door sales rule on the theory that when someone comes to your house, you're not in a market context. This is a sort of, much older regulatory innovation, but the idea is that maybe you're home and maybe you're in the middle of cleaning or cooking or something like that, and someone comes to your house and tries to sell you something. Well, the door-to-door sales rule is in recognition of the fact that you're not in a consumer position right then, and so what it says is that you have abilities to unravel, for example, the sale, and you get certain other things. Well, what about the fact that increasingly there are objects that are already in our house that are doing the same thing? They're choosing when to approach you. They're leveraging your hardwired responses to social interactions. Do we need a kind of sales rule for example, the Echo? And so that's one sort of, I don't know how long you want I should speak, but I mean, that's one example of something where you sort of worry about, do we need special protections given the intimate position that technologies increasingly have within our worlds. And then I have a couple other puzzles, which I won't get into such detail in because we got a lot of people that want to talk. One of which is, are standards of security sufficient? Because the notion of security has been for a long time now, the idea that you're hacking into something and by bypassing a security protocol. But today, lots of machines can be tricked through a process called adversarial machine learning. The idea being that rather than bypass the security protocol, you just purposely fool the system. So talk about Amazon again. To keep with the same example, researchers at Georgetown and Berkeley showed that you could play some white noise that none of us would think of as anything other than white noise, but it would surreptitiously cause Amazon to turn on the lights or to purchase something and so on. It was easily fooled in a way that was problematic. Are our security standards, if you put something out in the world that is easily tricked, a driverless car that can be tricked into perceiving a stop sign as a speed sign very easily, is that an unfairness problem, much like having a system that is not secure? And then the last thing, and I'll stop here, is I really worry quite a bit about the way in which highly intimate information can be derived by what feels to you like very ordinary information. The idea that the intimate can be derived from the available. It begins to break down this notion that somehow there's sensitive information, personal information, and that sharing it is problematic. Ultimately, if things about you can be derived from what feels to you like a mundane observation because of the extremely powerful tools of pattern recognition, perhaps we need to entirely rethink these categories of sensitive and personal and so on. So I'll leave my provocations there for now and pass it along, but thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Let me add my thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's both important and it's terrific that the FTC is doing this. I would say I think we need to sort of start with some maybe more basic principles, not about what the ethical issues are, but rather about the ways in which we raise them. So one of those, we need to recognize that AI is already all around us being used in many ways. And so a lot of today we've talked about AI as if it's coming, as if it's the future, if somehow we're like ahead of the game in discussing fairness and ethics and issues of consumer harm. Whereas once again, this is a case where we're behind the curve, as we almost always are. It's almost impossible to be ahead of technology. It's being used widely. Second, I think as with many of the areas involving information, and certainly anytime we talk about privacy, we're already discovering that people's concerns are highly subjective and contextual. So it really depends whether we're talking about my data or your data as to what my concerns are. It depends on what the AI is being used for. I wear an insulin pump. It uses a very sophisticated AI to try to predict what's happening. I hope it used all the personal data in the world and continues to use all the personal data in the world. But that's because it's keeping me alive. AI that's being used to market to me, I might have very different views about. And then third, I would just say I think we will find in that same vein that the types of concern that individuals have may be very different than what society has. And so what we know, I think about the number of people I know who work in privacy, who spend their days talking about privacy, who really care about privacy, and who have a half dozen or more Echo devices at home. So individuals don't always make rational choices, and we should recognize we might be concerned about something, but they're voting with their feet and their pocketbook. They know what they're getting into, and they're doing it anyway. And then finally, I would say they're the typical set of concerns that we have almost anything, whether it's a refrigerator or a car or what have you. Now it, of course, involves data, and that is that it be reliable, that it be accurate to the extent it's something that we care about accuracy. In other words, I want the automatic brakes that use sensors on my car to work consistently. I want them to work only when there's something in front of me and not just to make it up and start slamming on brakes in the middle of the interstate. And I want to have recourse if they don't work. I want to know where I can go, whether it's a court or the company or an ombudsman or the FTC, to get recourse when they don't work.
So we've heard some great things already, and I guess we'll be jumping into many of these things in more detail. So I'll just add two other things. So from a technologist point of view, I guess I think about I have two other things that I think I would add. One is from just a process perspective in terms of doing consumer protection. It's a lot harder, I think, to do consumer protection when you don't have visibility into what is going on. And so what I mean by that is AI offers the ability to personalize things to a tremendous degree. I mean, we've already seen this with targeted advertising online. And it's very hard for an outside organization like the FTC to see exactly, what ads people are being shown and based on what criteria unless the company that is actually showing those ads makes a conscious effort. And some have. So to be clear, this is something that's going on, but it's an ongoing problem. The other, talking a little bit, Ryan mentioned adversarial examples. The other thing, and I think we'll dive into this a little more, my concern is just unintended errors. Problems, AI is great, but it makes decisions in ways that humans don't. And so it can make decisions that no human would ever make, even without an adversarial example, and that no human would even be thinking that an AI would make. And so, if that happens once, that's just, it's a one-off, it's an accident. But then what happens when we're replicating this across all of society and we find out that, 1% of the time it will make some decision about a person. And if you talk about the entire population in the US, now we're talking about millions and millions of people who are getting a very weird one-off decision. And so I think we can talk about that a little more too. Thanks.
So as a representative from the industry, from our perspective, there's consumer impact with AI, regardless, positive and negative, because there are mistakes that AI makes at times. So the importance from our perspective, as part of the company perspective, is that we need to make sure that we analyze it up front. So if you think about privacy, back in the day, there was a lot of discussion around privacy by design and companies implementing privacy by design. And how companies did that is they implemented privacy impact assessments in a lot of their products. Similarly, it's very informative for companies to implement AI by design, in a sense that they should be assessing upfront, because AI is out there. And we're using it in companies everywhere. And so understanding upfront with an impact assessment of all of the different scenarios and how it can impact the consumer in a biased way and in an unbiased way, so that you make sure that you understand upfront all of the different scenarios, and so that you can weigh the probability and design it in such a way such that fairness plays a role, and that AI is not being used to create mistakes or to make unfair decisions.
Sure. So please let me give 1 minute to thank the FTC for having me here, and also for putting together today's session, which has been very informative. As my initial remarks, I think one of the things that we've learned throughout the day is that AI is a catch-all term. AI is going to be applied to the credit score system, to the healthcare system, to self-driving cars. So basically it's going to impact all areas of society. So when discussing and when drilling down what ethical concerns we have and thinking about them from a consumer protection perspective, I would suggest to frame this discussion comparing machine learning to the status quo. And what I mean by this is that maybe we should try to talk about AI in the context of healthcare and try to think whether there's any difference to what we have right now, and whether the current regulations focusing on consumer harm or privacy are sufficient to cover the same kind of concerns we have when machine learning is being used. And one of the things that we need to acknowledge, and sorry if I'm being a little bit pessimistic here, but human being and human decisions are not perfect either. So we can't hope to have all decisions made by machines also to be perfect. And some considerations that we might have is that sometimes we might want to deploy AI systems knowingly that they are imperfect, because they bring added value to humanity. And the balancing those trade-offs, I think, is going to be key for the future of machine learning and deploying future technology.
Act, Fair Credit Reporting Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. How well do these statutes address the issues that have been raised by these recent technologies? And Irene, I see you nodding, so I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So Checker, for those that don't know, Checker is a background check company that provides a platform to help companies hire faster and in a more compliant fashion. So from our standpoint, we are regulated already by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So when I think about regulations in AI and the FTC Act in itself, I believe that the FTC Act is drafted broad enough. Section 5 is so broad in terms of how it says unfair and deceptive practices. And so it's used in such a broad way that you could apply any technology to it. So instead of developing technology-specific laws, it's important for regulators to keep in mind that companies like ours and others have other regulations that are not just FTC Act specific. So for example, we have FCRA Act that requires us to comply with maximum possible accuracy requirements, for example. So if we're producing a report about you as an individual, we need to make sure that it provides maximum possible accuracy. So in doing that, when we're even implementing AI, we need to make sure that AI technology isn't making mistakes, it's identifying the right person, and that it's creating the accurate report that we need. And so there are a number of other sectors like ours that are governed by different laws. So if you're in healthcare, obviously you have the healthcare FDA laws, and if you're doing robo advisory from a fintech perspective, there's SEC laws. And so there are a number of regulations that other companies are also subject to that really put that checks and balances on what companies can do with AI. So I think it's really important for regulators to think about that holistically, other than just the law that they're regulating.
So I think this is a great question, and I want to take the two laws you mentioned separately. So the Federal Trade Commission Act in Section 5, unfairness and deceptive trade practices, actually I've never met a regulator anywhere in the world who wouldn't like to have that authority, because of its breadth, because of the fact it's not limited by a specific type of harm, but because of the reach, and therefore it applies to new technologies without somebody having to update the law or say, and we mean artificial intelligence as well. Now, having said that, it's kind of an end of the road type of law. It doesn't tell you anything up front. It doesn't give you any prospective guidance. And these are things the FTC does in other ways and other regulators do in other ways. So I doubt if it's, if you will, going to be adequate to deal with all of the challenges that AI might present. But I think it's a very broad, flexible law, and in many ways we give it too little credit for its value in this area. FCRA, I actually think, is discovering a new birth, a new life. And again, maybe not exactly as written. This may require some amendment. But this notion of taking something where you use lots of data, that data could be used in ways that affects people, could be used in ways that wouldn't affect people. So you create some general obligations up front, but you make most of the significant rights, the real actionable rights, depend on something happening that would trigger an individual's interest in saying, wait a minute, I may have been disadvantaged or harmed, and then other rights kick in, access to the data, or a dispute, a mechanism for dealing with accuracy, and so forth. And I think this could actually be a model that we think of as we identify issues, whether it's around AI or big data or other types of intensive data uses, a model for the future as well.
I think I'm going to tend to agree with what Fred and Irene just said. And from a European perspective, I think that the US has a technology agnostic approach to consumer protection. And I don't think that should change with AI, because of what I said in the beginning, is going to affect all aspects of our lives. And what I really think we need to focus on is to see whether potential consumer harms are covered, or whether the laws are sufficiently broad to tackle those. And if that happens, then enforce the law as they are. Some new consumer harms might appear, but I believe that the current system is sufficiently broad to cover those, probably. If not, I'm sure that you will find a way, but I wouldn't move towards a non-tech agnostic approach. I think that could be bad for innovation, and that doesn't really make much sense if what you're trying to resolve is potential consumer harm. You should focus on whether consumers are being harmed or not when thinking of regulations or not.
With that said, though, the FTC could definitely play a role in providing guidelines, not necessarily changing laws or creating laws, but the FTC has been known to create guidelines in the past, for example, security in the Internet of Things, mobile security, facial recognition, and those are some of the aspects where the FTC did voice its opinion and provided guidelines to businesses, especially in this area of AI where a lot of companies are implementing AI and it's rapidly moving. The FTC could influence in a way by providing a guidance, policy statement around their perspective on AI and how to use it fairly and to create a fair system that protects consumers.
So following up on that, obviously the FTC in 2012 put out our privacy framework. And then a couple of years ago, we did a report on big data where we sort of laid out how different legal laws that we apply could, laws that we enforce could apply in that area. So are there issues that are unique to AI that are not covered by those existing policy statements?
No, go for it. Go for it.
I mean, I think it would be, I think we need to back out a little bit and say to ourselves, okay, if artificial intelligence is as powerful as proponents say, and if it's going to remake society the way that proponents say, then also we're going to need to have changes to law and legal institutions. In other words, in my view, it's either a bunch of hype or we're going to have to make deep changes to our society. You see, I mean, it can't be like, oh my God, AI is going to change everything, but nothing should change. Right? That doesn't actually make a lot of intuitive sense. But let me just be more concrete. The kinds of harms that I envision with artificial intelligence that may be unique are twofold. There are wrong harms and there are right harms. And the wrong harms are when you get it wrong. And the line drawing problem that the FTC and others have to figure out is how wrong do you got to get it? How easy is it to get it wrong before there's a problem? You know, and that's true whether it's wildly inaccurate, in which case the credit reporting has something to say about it. But I also think it's just like if something is extremely easy to fool, even though in order to fool the system you don't need to bypass any security protocol, I wonder whether that might constitute unfair design in much the same way that designing something that's really easy to hack might. And then there's a set of right harms, and these are even harder. And these are the kinds of harms that happen when the technology is actually extremely accurate. And we got to ask questions about that too, right? I mean, so what law, for example, prohibits Uber from using Grayball to figure out whether the people that are in the Uber are law enforcement? You know what I mean? I don't know, but that's an extremely innovative, interesting new thing to do, is to use algorithms to figure out if maybe the people in the car are going to be police and then avoiding them, right? And yet, when the Federal Trade Commission pursued Uber, they pursued them, you all pursued them along very similar lines to the way in which the FTC pursued Amway decades ago. In other words, the big cardinal sin originally for Uber was that it represented that people were going to make more money on the weekend than they actually were going to make. And that was also Amway's big cardinal sin. But think about the difference between Amway and Uber. I mean, this is sea change. So I think that the Federal Trade Commission Act is quite broad, and unfairness and deception is a dream at one level. Has some notice problems, as Fred alluded to, but what has to happen is assertiveness. We need to make sure that the Federal Trade Commission has the bandwidth and the mandate to go in there and ask the hard questions, to direct inquiries to figure out exactly what's going on. Because I think one of the big problems is that a lot of the harms that are, whether the wrong harms or right harms, are invisible harms, and they will not come to the fore unless the FTC uses its authority to reach in and find out, or if some reporter like Julia Angwin figures it out. Right? And so, I mean, I do think we have adequate tools, and I think the FTC is precisely the right agency to do it. But I think they need to be given that mandate to, look, be assertive. This is a new world. That's what we're being told. We're being told this is a new world where everything changes. Well, the FTC should change, and it should pursue these things very assertively. That's my own position. I think you all are the right agency to do it with the right tools, but I think that assertiveness needs to come back.
So the one thing I would add to that is that transparency can help with that too. And it may mean that we need some sort of mandated transparency when it comes to AI tools. Now, this isn't to say that we would want the same transparency for all AI tools ever. It's going to be an entirely different type of transparency for, how does your washing machine decide the optimal neural network optimized way of washing your clothes versus, how does Uber decide whether or not, you should get a ride because it thinks you're law enforcement. So we definitely need some sort of context specific, but that could help an agency like the FTC be able to see when the sorts of things that Ryan was just talking about are taking place, as if we had some sort of mandated transparency.
I think another way, and just to follow on Jeremy's point, we've always thought of transparency, at least in the kind of the data or the data privacy world, as meaning like explaining what you're doing to people who frankly don't care. So we've shoved notices down their throat, they don't read them. We say, oh, we'll make them prettier, we'll make them shorter, we'll make them layered. And at the end of the day, people just don't read notices. That's just the reality. It's a sad but inconvenient truth. So one thing we might think about is what would transparency work like in this area? So part of that might be documenting what you're doing. In other words, it might be saying, building a record in exactly the way we require for human subjects research now. So, we have the Belmont Principles that led to some law. If you take federal dollars, you have to do this. You then have an IRB, the Institutional Review Board has to decide when you're going to do things that affect humans. You have to document it. You don't go to an agency to get permission. The FTC would be overwhelmed if that were the case. But then if something bad happens, if humans are injured, if something unexpected happens, then the institution can be required to produce its documentation that shows it followed a proper procedure, it used the right calculation. Sometimes bad things just happen, even if you do everything right. And so I think one of the things we collectively need to be thinking more creatively about is what does transparency look like in a field as rich and fast-moving as AI and big data and other types of high data-intensive fields, and what it might be supplemented with, so that we say, maybe it doesn't mean transparency to the end user who spent all of his or her life avoiding transparency, but rather transparency so that it's available for a regulator or for an advocacy group, or if it's needed in litigation or for other purposes.
It's definitely important to have that transparency. And so as companies are building, again, when I talk about that impact assessment, it's important to think about auditability and explainability, not only to the consumers, but also potential regulators. And I know Ryan mentioned earlier that AI is huge and it's rapid moving, and so potentially FTC needs a clear authority on it. From my perspective, if we start that route, we're doing that with everything. Everything was big, mobile was big, Internet of Things is big. So with every single new technology that emerges, to give FTC a clear authority on each one, I think is adding burdens and layers of enforcement, the broad enforcement that they need and that they already have. And so from my perspective, while it's important to have that transparency, enforceability, auditability in the companies for AI in general, I just don't think that we should be creating technology-specific laws or enforcement mechanisms within the FTC for specific technologies, because there will be new things that will be rapidly emerging again, and we'll say this is the next big thing. So at that point, do we build another framework then?
Yeah. Oh, please. And I was gonna react to the discussion taking place right now, saying three things. First, I'm a big fan of the FTC, so of course they should have the mandate. I think that's the case when consumers are being harmed, and that is irrespective of whether the harm to consumer is being produced by machine learning technology or not. I am going to support the technology agnostic approach to it, to be able we protect consumers, which is what we care about here. Then with respect to the trade-off between accuracy and explainability, which I think is a very, very hard balance to make and a hard analysis to make, I think this is not new. Think about, for example, gender-based price discrimination when it comes to paying for car insurances. Well, women tend to pay less than men, because basically it's easy to predict based on gender who's going to have more accidents or not. So not everything is new. Some of those trade-offs and some of the hard analysis we need to make between accuracy of systems and explainability, we are already thinking about them, and they already exist in our society. And the last point I wanted to make is that with respect to transparency, I think it is important, very important, because these systems are very complicated, but I also think we need to have an approach where the different degrees of transparency exist. So for example, if I go to the doctor and what I'm trying to find is whether I have breast cancer or not, I don't think I need to know how the machine created all the neural networks to find out that I'm gonna have breast cancer. I just want to know whether it's accurate or not and just have a treatment. Whereas the doctor might need a different degree of transparency to be able to ascertain the diagnosis. So I think we need to bring the transparency debate to a more down-to-earth or more reality-based approach and analyze it on a case-by-case basis.
I guess I,
I'm not. It's just on.
I mean, I guess, I mean, look, first of all, I'm not arguing that personally, I'm not arguing that the Federal Trade Commission should get like AI authority. It'd be kind of cool, like you get little badges with an AI division, but that's not what I'm arguing. I mean, right? I mean,
Would
so
they say RoboCop?
they would say RoboCop on them. That this is ingenious. You know, I mean, I think that what I'm saying rather has to do with just how inquisitive the agency is, right? So imagine that we're talking about not talking about, you know, consumer harms for a moment. We're backing out. We're talking about people making crystal meth in their houses. You know what I mean? And imagine the way that we regulated that. We would say, listen, take a list of the ingredients that you bought recently and post them in front of your house. And if we walk over them and any of them look like they might be the wrong ingredients, then what we'll do is we'll follow up or something like. No, I mean there's a hugely different stance when an agency, a federal agency that's been imbued with enforcement power, is asking pointed, difficult questions, making you explain yourself. There's a big difference between that and a kind of transparency that where you just sort of get to pick what you want to share. You know what I mean? And so again, I don't think there should be a special AI task force within the FTC exactly, but rather I think that the FTC needs to use all of its tools. And I think that and you know, listen, frankly, just to speak plainly, I have tenure now, so I can speak plainly about things. You know, there's been a history here where the FTC will pursue more assertively consumer protection issues, and then what happens is Congress or the courts has placed limits on that. So if I were the Federal Trade Commission, I'd be constantly thinking about what the right balance is to strike, okay? But we're in a moment. We got huge companies calling for legislation, okay? We have privacy legislation in California that we're gonna want to standardize and so on. And so this is a big moment. This is a time when we should be expanding is what I'm trying to say. But we have the tools, and I don't think we need to confer any special authority. I just wanted to add that.
So just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, please pass in a card. This is a hot bench, so I'm sure they'd be happy to answer whatever you want to know. But I want to follow up a little bit on the previous discussion. Ryan pointed out that, you know, we need to go in and ask the hard questions in order to sort of get to the heart of the matter. And so I want to toss it to Jeremy first as to what are the hard questions that we need to answer in order to increase transparency and explainability.
So I was actually just as you said that, I was thinking I was going to answer an entirely different question. That's okay. In terms of answering, you know, what are the hard questions about explainability and transparency? I think I agree quite a bit with Fred about that transparency to the end user probably isn't the right solution. We've seen lots and lots of that, and we've seen lots and lots of it fail. I'm actually going to just use my prerogative and answer a slightly different question, which is, what are the hard questions that the FTC should be asking, not just about explainability and transparency, but about bias and fairness? Because that's one that I've been thinking a lot about lately. And I think the right answer there is if you're talking about a product or a service that has a material impact on someone's life, and I'm going to use that definition pretty broadly. I'm even going to include online advertising in that sense. I think the question you should be asking is what sort of de-biasing or what sort of fairness calibration, what sort of technical measure did you use? What definition of fairness are you using? Not, we're going to say you must use demographic parity or equality of opportunity or, any of these but we are going to ask which one you picked and did you do the appropriate calibration? Because if you're not thinking about how you can de-bias the results of your algorithm in some way, then you're clearly not thinking about the problem hard enough. So I would throw that one out there as that's the tough question that the FTC should be asking.
Following up a little bit on that, though, is there a risk that that the black box of AI is so complicated that we can't identify what is causing any of the bias,
So
or how to correct it?
so the neat thing about the correction part is there's actually a lot of active research, or rather in the last couple of years, some papers published about how to take any black box algorithm and correct it to some level. You pick some certain type of fairness metric, and to be clear, by this I'm talking about a mathematical fairness metric that says we want the same number of, or same rate of false positives, or we want the same rate of false negatives. As we heard earlier today, there are many of these. I think at last count I saw some paper that said there's like 24 different ones you could choose from. Many of them are incompatible with each other, but you can pick one, and you can do it post hoc. You don't need to actually go in and tweak the algorithm. You can do it after the fact to the algorithm. And so I'm not too worried about the black box nature or the explainability part of AI. I mean, that was another thing we saw earlier today too, was I think it was a gentleman from Google who was showing how they've done some really neat research on explainability for AI systems, and including visualization. And so I really don't see for me, the lack of explainability about AI is that companies generally don't want to share information about their algorithms because they're worried that they'll lose their secret sauce, and I totally understand that. But it is not about that the algorithms themselves are somehow incomprehensible or unexplainable just because they're on a computer.
This is a question from the audience. Given the decentralized privacy protections in the United States, how will consumers be completely protected from harm from AI devices where the harm falls outside the regulatory authority of the FTC?
So I'm glad you asked that. So first of all, consumers are never going to be completely protected from harm, and we should stop talking as if it's possible. And that's always been the case with individual decisions as well. We've had rampant discrimination in individual decisions, in credit, in policing, in all admissions, for decades, for centuries. And so the notion that somehow AI is going to eliminate all that, and that's the standard we should hold it to, is just setting us up for a fall. I mean, we will just get rid of AI, and we will be the much poorer for it. Second of all, it's interesting that the question couched this in terms of privacy, a word we've actually not used much up here at all. And when we talked about possible harms, privacy wasn't a prominent one. I mean, we've talked about lots of harms that you might say relate to privacy, but it was interesting, while Jeremy was talking, I was thinking to do the things he's talking about, which are really important, you need data. You need to keep the data. The way you detect, for example, that you're getting a biased result is because you have data about the outcomes. You've collected the data that reveal the bias. And so we're going to have to recognize there can be some trade-offs here. In other words, we might say in order to deal with questions of fairness or bias, we actually hang on to more data. Or to deal with accuracy, we actually have to hang on to more data. And so I think we should at least be honest with each other about the amount of tension between these various goals. And then just the last thing I would say is the question used the word harm, which is a word I've used a lot. I like it because nobody knows what it means, so you can comfortably use it. And like Ryan will go write a law review article about it by tonight, so and show why we're all wrong. But the problem with harm is we don't really know what they are. In other words, it's harm using my data without consent? Is it using a way that causes me actual injury, physical injury, financial injury, some sort of severe emotional injury? Is it non-compliance with some law relating to data? Is that by itself harm? And so one thing which I keep saying as we talk about AI, we need to also be talking about what are the things we're trying to maximize and the things we're trying to minimize. So what do we agree are benefits? That conversation seems to be fairly easy. And what do we agree are the bad things that we would like to minimize because they're not going to be consistent. So that's going to be a controversial conversation, which frankly, the FTC is in a good position to help lead. Oh dear, here it
No,
comes.
I'm not. I mean, nothing's coming apart from me decimating. No, just kidding. No, nothing's coming. I first of all, I agree with. I fundamentally agree with Fred that we got to get over this idea that reflexively that just because you gather more information, that's bad. You know what I mean? More information often is very good, and it's very good for consumers in many contexts. I guess what I would say about harm. I mean, so take for example a relatively well-known phenomenon when I believe it was one of the test prep companies, I think it was Princeton Review, was found to be charging more based on zip code for test preparation in Asian American communities, right? That feels like the wrong thing to do, and it feels like the kind of thing where I would, if I had a magic wand, go and ask a lot of pointed questions about what other players are doing in this space, what other metrics are using to charge differential prices, and so on, right? And the harm, of course, is that because you live in a particular neighborhood and there are certain assumptions about the way that you value test prep, you're paying more money. Sometimes it's not at all hard to see the harm. The harm is just you're paying more money. Or with the lifetime value score that the Wall Street Journal and later NPR discussed, with the idea that you might be on hold for a very long time because you have a low LVS. These harms are pretty tangible, they're not well understood, and I want us to be knocking on that door asking lots of questions about these kinds of practices.
At the same time, AI isn't driven by just PII. So there's a lot of data that we're collecting that's anonymized, that's aggregated. And so from a privacy perspective, it may not raise privacy concerns. And so it's really important to differentiate those that's creating the using information that may not be personally identifiable to you to better your life. And so in that sense, I think it's important for, as we're looking at enforcement mechanisms, to think about privacy, whether it's really impacting the individual, the consumer. And secondly, again, I talk about AI by design and also an AI impact framework. And so in that same sense, I really love the Google's principles around AI. One of the things that they also emphasize is the importance of privacy by design when you're developing AI frameworks. And so that's something that companies should do, and I think this is a policy guideline that potentially the FTC can encourage companies to use, just like how it's done before, in terms of encouraging privacy by design in AI frameworks as well too.
Yeah, so I tend to agree with that, but also when we discuss privacy, we need to understand that privacy means a lot of things to a lot of people, and the value of privacy changes on a consumer by consumer basis. Like if you ask people whether they care about environment and climate change, probably almost everybody these days will say, yes, I do care, but then not everybody recycles. So, we also need to understand when consumers act rationally or not, to discuss the privacy requirements and what degree of privacy we want to protect. Because I'm thinking of going back to my previous example, I think everybody would like to be able to use AI to identify potential cancers and to be able to have a more accurate approach that determines whether you're going to be sick or not well in advance, as we saw the examples earlier today. I'm also sure that people don't want to have their medical records disclosed. And I think that tension is what we need to look into it and try to see whether the current laws allow us to ensure that the consumers have their, for example, medical records preserved, which I think we can with the current laws, and how to make sure that society takes advantage of AI to, for example, advance the technologies that help us identify potential cancers for all of us. And I think the discussions need to be, as I said in the beginning, brought to real cases and have honest conversations about what we want and what we don't want, because AI can bring a lot of advantages for society, and we don't want to stop those. We certainly do want to protect certain privacy elements, for example, medical records, etc. But we need to do it on a case-by-case basis and make sure we don't impair the incentives to progress with these technologies for the good of everyone.
So it's interesting that you talk about medical records, because I think it was last week I was watching our big data hearing, and someone said like most health-related information that's available is not necessarily protected information. It's more commercially available information. And so I'm just wondering if AI can apply in that sort of space, or how would you design protections around AI in a space where many levels of information are not protected in the traditional sense, or where you can infer data from someone from a non-protected data set?
So I would argue, this may be answering a different question, but that it is not very valuable to be looking at the data. It is much more valuable to be using at the use and its impact on the individual. So it doesn't matter whether I get your health record or whether I figure it out from the way you use your iPhone. If out of that I make a conclusion about your health status and I do something with regard to that, presumably the impact on the individual, for example, if it affects insurance rates or it affects willingness of someone to employ you, or uses that we would consider suspect, it shouldn't really matter the type of data. It should matter the type of use. And I think AI is going to really drive that home, because we can now make so many. Remember, AI is all about probabilities, and the probability that that's your face, the probability that that's the way it translates from Mandarin into English, the probability that whatever, that you have cancer, that you are pregnant, that you have some other condition. And I think we're going to have to stop worrying about where the data came. We may worry about that for other reasons. Maybe there was a promise the data wouldn't be used, or there's some contractual issue that has to be dealt with, but rather much more concerned about the use and the impact on the individual.
Companies should overall just be thinking about what solution they're trying to drive at with AI. So it's important at the design phase, not only thinking about I think a lot of companies, when they have data, they think about how can I exploit this? And instead of using that framework, it's important for companies to think about what solution am I trying to solve? What use case am I trying to solve? What user's life am I trying to make better or easier? And using what data can I use from that to help develop a solution or a machine learning solution that can help better that life of that user. And so with that context, they should also think about what data do they need to collect. So collecting only the data that's needed versus here's a data set that I have, how can I exploit this? And that's not necessarily the right framework to go by from a company standpoint, but rather thinking about solution based. And I think that will help drive solutions that mitigate the consumer harm.
I just want to completely agree with Irene. From an engineering perspective, it's also just bad statistics to say, I've got the data, I've found some data somewhere, now let me do something with it. Because how you collect the data is going to influence what data you have, which will influence how accurate it is. And if you're going to do something, if you say, well, I want to use it for some other purpose, and so I will just, I know how to modify the records, or I know what portion of the data to throw out, then you already sort of know what conclusion you're trying to get. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is, for example, say I've got some data set that I collected. Never mind. I was going to go into a pretty technical example. If you're curious about this, I'm happy to talk with folks afterwards. Let me leave it at that.
So Jeremy, one of the things that you mentioned previously was the fact that the lack of data, the availability of data, actually assists in identifying when there has been bias implemented in AI. Could you discuss that just a little bit in a particular instance?
Yeah. I think so what I was talking about was that if the purpose of the AI system is to do personalization, so this isn't here now. We're not talking about systems that detect if there's breast cancer, or like the Adobe presentation that happened earlier where it's, I've got some image and I want to find similar stock photos. I'm talking more about targeted advertising, or, making loan decisions, that sort of thing, where the only person who's going to see, generally speaking, the result of some decision is the person that decision applies to and whoever is making the decision. And so the concern here is that there's just no visibility from the outside world. If I were advertising 30 years ago and I chose to take out an ad in certain magazines, then anyone can go pick up that magazine and look and see what ads am I showing in which magazines, and am I showing certain ads to magazines with certain demographics. Now it's a lot harder to do that. If I'm on Facebook or one of the other various online advertising companies, it's much, much harder. And then they're also doing all sorts of inference to say who is, if I want to target people of a certain demographic, with a certain background, with a certain interest, some of that is going to be inferred data. It's not actually going to be data that was actually collected. And so it's even that much harder to be able to tell, am I doing something that is having some unfair impact in some way?
Yes, I agree, but just a clarification, there is users who decide when they go and select online advertising who they want to target and who they don't want to target. So it's not so much the companies that do. So maybe the bias, we find it in the user who wanted to target advertise. So you have options, you want to target this zip code, you want to target this audience, you want to target, there's like a list that you can select. So I think when we discuss bias in that respect, we also need to question ourselves when we make the selections.
Yeah, I mean, part of it does, depending on the particular platform, fall on the platform. So a good example of this is the current complaints against Facebook, that their housing and employment ads, the framework was actually designed so that it was easy to discriminate based on race. And that was a choice that Facebook made in how they designed their platform and what characteristics they offered in those sorts of advertising. So it's totally true that a lot of the time it is the person who's buying the advertising. It is choices they're making, but also some of it does apply to the platforms and what choices they offer the person who's buying the advertising.
Building on that example, you have the Fair Housing Act, or you have the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in the credit space, where there is the FTC has enforced that law in the past. However, taking those in the credit space or housing space sort of out of that, when you have bias, this is a question from the audience, what general authority does the FTC have to attack bias in the Section 5 context? Is it broad enough that it's been used to attack bias on the Unfairness Authority?
That is an excellent question. I don't know who you are that asked that. Very good question. No, I mean it goes to the issue that Fred and I were talking about, and which is the idea of what counts as harm, right? I mean, so especially under the newish, decades-old unfairness standard, you have to weigh your regulatory intervention, against whether there's actual harm, and also you have to look at the benefit to society and to consumers and to the market of the. And so, for example, if you were to bring something that you could show was societally valuable, right, and had a value to the market and to the consumer, but also it had bias in it, even if we were to countenance bias as being a harm, I don't think it would be so obvious that would constitute a problem. I mean, it's non-trivial. What I will say is that I'm a little surprised that we're not talking a little bit more about deception. And in particular, I'm a little surprised we're not talking about the way in which a lot of companies have way overclaimed about what this stuff can do. You know what I mean? Way overclaimed. So I mean, for example, like I was in I'm not going to name company names. I was gonna, but I'm not gonna. I was in an airport, and I saw this advertisement in the airport, and it was just a bunch of people that all looked similar to each other. Like it was like a cartoon, and then the bottom it said, "Artificial intelligence has already identified who the terrorist is." No, it has not done that. That is incorrect. It has not done that. That is a way overclaim. And so when sometimes these people, just if you sell nutritional supplements that don't do what they're supposed to do, or if you sell anything that doesn't do it, usually you get in trouble for deceiving. But for some reason, we're giving these folks that are advertising about AI a pass. I don't understand why, right? I mean, there's verifiable BS out there, and I don't understand why it's not deceptive.
Have some more questions from the audience. Can you describe new harms AI may cause And examples are synthetic video and audio and virtual agents not identifying themselves as virtual.
I can talk a little bit about the virtual agents not identifying themselves as virtual because Electronic Frontier Foundation actually worked on a law in California that was recently passed that was basically a online bot labeling act. And the tricky part of this law, there were a bunch of problems with it. We got most of them solved. One is what actually counts as a virtual agent or what counts as a bot. So let's restrict ourselves to social media, say. So does it count as too much automation if I'm using something, if I write a bunch of tweets and then schedule them? Is that too much automation and I have to disclose that I scheduled them? What about if I've got a program, because I'm a, nerd, and I wrote up a program that will just automatically generate tweets. But then I review each one and I pick which ones to post. Do I have to disclose do I have to disclose that part? It gets into a very hard line drawing exercise when you're talking about what level of automation. There are other parts too about if you mandate things like an account has to disclose that it's a bot. How do you enforce that? Basically, you have to start unmasking people, and then you get into the harms of eliminating anonymous online speech. And anonymous speech is something we value very highly in this country. And if you're starting to eradicate that online, you have to have a pretty good reason. It looked like Fred was going to say something, so I'm going to turn it over to him, and we'll see where this conversation goes.
I was just going to say, I think we're running the risk on this panel of being awfully narrow in what we're thinking about as AI. In other words, it's not just marketing and personalization and targeted tweets. Right, so AI is being used to deliver healthcare. AI is the way we're examining MRI and CT scan images. In other words, the harms that we're talking about aren't. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote a letter to the president of a company because I actually still believe presidents of companies love to hear from me. And I got an answer back almost immediately. I sent it electronically. And then I spent the next 3 weeks trying to figure out, was AI what did that? And I'm absolutely convinced that AI is what did it. Was I harmed by the fact I got a nice response that came from AI rather than the actual president of the company who didn't sit around responding to my letter? This just to me does not seem like the big issue. On the other hand, not correctly diagnosing melanoma because we are using AI to say, is that image likely to be cancerous? That's a harm. That's a really serious harm. Your car not braking for a pedestrian, that's a serious harm that is AI related. We're using AI in some cities to determine where police are based on calculations of sophisticated data and real-time data about where things are likely to go wrong. So not having police where you actually need them, that's a real harm. People will die because of that harm. And so as seriously as we can take the I got the wrong ad or I got a letter from the CEO that really came from a virtual agent, I think we need to be opening up our understanding of where AI is being used in this economy because it's massive. It's being used to determine where we water crops and don't water crops. And it's being used to determine really sophisticated, life-changing things. I think it's going to matter to the public, frankly, more than the email they got. I'm not criticizing the email. I care about that. And can I send mine to you, and will you tell me that AI generate it?
I can take a look.
Thank you.
No promises.
I just want to say that I wrote a paper with a co-author about the California disclosure requirement that said that it has some First Amendment issues with it. The truth is that communicating with bots is a new form of communication and one that needs some breathing room. And I think that one potential harm is that these emerging technologies will freak us out, and we will overreact. And I think that's personally what California did. And I think even the current version, although because of the efforts of folks at EFF like Jeremy, is much better than what it started out as. I still think, and I think my co-author thinks, that it's got some First Amendment issues. I mean, you can go check out regulating bot speech. It's coming out in UCLA law review, but, you know, see what you think. But I think there's some real harms to overdoing it too, and I don't mean to be saying we should, you know, top-down regulate everything.
Yeah, and we've seen some examples elsewhere of some jurisdictions willing to regulate upfront AI or the necessary elements for AI to work, and that is not necessarily, at this moment at least, the right approach if we want to take advantage of the full potential that machine learning has. And I think what we forget, because now we're hearing a lot about AI and machine learning, is that yes, AI has existed for more than 50 years, but really we're only in the nascent moment of the life cycle. We're just beginning to understand the full potential of it. And if we start putting barriers to it, we might not even be able to allow the engineers to test and see where this can take us. So I think we need to, yes, worry about consumer harm for sure. And FTC be worry about that and make sure that companies are able to explain their systems and there's no bias, etc. But at this moment, it's really the beginning, and let us see where we go, and let's have more workshops, and let's keep learning as we did today and see where the technology stands. This morning we learned that we talk about the full potential, but what engineers can actually do at this moment is not the full potential of AI. We're still working on the systems and on deep learning, etc. So I think it's very healthy to maintain these discussions. It's extremely important to probably do regular workshops on these matters, but to cross the line and regulate everything, I think it's just too early.
This is open to the whole panel. So are there particular contexts or uses where AI should not be used since it is a nascent area? Should there be a wait and see approach in certain instances?
So it's not related to the FTC's domain, but EFF, along with I think like 70 other, maybe 60 or 70 other civil rights organizations and civil liberties organizations, signed a letter saying that AI was not currently appropriate for bail, parole, basically in the criminal justice context. That we don't think that the sufficient rules are there, and those are, as Fred was alluding to, seriously life-impacting decisions. And so, although it's not in the realm of what the FTC would work on, I think that's one that I think it's important to note, where they are vendors are starting to market and sell AI-related or AI-based risk assessment tools, and we definitely don't think it's appropriate.
I think I agree. As I said earlier, I think the trade-off between explainability and accuracy and that tension that exists there is different, whereas you apply AI to the potential email you get or whether you're going to incarcerate the person. So I think the debate needs to be done on a very sector by sector basis and really take accountability of the realities that that decision is going to encounter. So for example, if as a result of applying AI, somebody's going to go to jail and we cannot ensure that it's that accurate, I would be more cautious than in other instances, for example.
And building off of that a bit, and depending on what type of AI is being implemented, what choices and notice should consumers have regarding the use of these types of technologies? I mean, does it vary, or should it be constant? Irene?
Thanks. From a notice and consent standpoint, it's definitely important, and most companies also are regulated not only by the FTC Act and others, but especially for those that are doing business in Europe, there's GDPR as well. And so there's a consent and notice requirement there, especially particularly with regards to use of AI. And so it's important to provide that notice to comply with GDPR, and it's also important to provide that notice for transparency purposes from a consumer standpoint. But where, what I liked about Mariella's perspective earlier is how much transparency you want to give to the users, because it could be confusing. So in the example that she provided earlier, the doctor may want to understand what type of database was used versus the patient. And so in that context, you don't want to flood consumers with too much information about the type of AI in the database and PII, or even any type of information that's being used. It needs to be, it needs to serve its purpose of providing transparency, but not over transparency, that it causes confusion and misleads consumers.
So what does notice and consent look like in an AI context? And I'll take an example I think that many people can understand, which is credit scoring and credit reports. And it's built off of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which provides for access to a copy of your report, dispute rights, things along those lines. But in that space, you get a report. It lists, your credit lines and credit accounts, or it lists any criminal history you may have, or your educational history. It lists a series of items that you can then look at and see whether or not they're accurate and correct them if they're not. And once those items are corrected, that will have an impact on the ultimate decision. But in an AI space, how can you replicate that, or what alternatives should there be?
Fred is a deep expert on notice and choice, one of the leading experts on notice and choice in America. But I mean, I will hazard something, which is that what's interesting about artificial intelligence, at least when we come to embody it in an agent, which is something that somebody asked about, is that it can be awfully contextual and dynamic, right? And so I think that we ought to be encouraging the possibility of having a conversation with Alexa about Amazon's privacy practices is, I think, quite exciting, and the idea, I mean, maybe you're anti, but I mean, the idea being that you could ask specific questions rather than have some stupid thing that was like really long and you're never going to read it, but you could say, hey, Alexa, can Amazon turn on you remotely to listen in on a conversation, and then get an answer about that? I think that's actually pretty powerful personally. But
I'm not anti. I just think maybe only the people on this panel would find it super exciting to have a conversation with Alexa about, which isn't to say it'd be neat. I agree. I just don't think the vast majority of consumers would get a ton out of it.
I mean, I think it's critical when you're thinking about emerging technology generally, not to just focus on what's lost, but what new affordances might be there, what you might gain, And I think that these things are quite powerful, and I think, we're getting to a place where natural conversations are becoming more viable, and I think that we should therefore, if you think about it, notice and choice, we've been operating under basically Gutenberg technology all this time, right? We just publish a long thing, whether it's a digital or a print, just a bunch of words on a page, and yet, here we have companies that are doing these amazing things about organizing information and engaging you and so on. I think there's a lot of innovation that could be occurring with notice. And part of it would be to contextualize and actually answer questions about this consumer instead of just having something that no one reads.
I would echo everything Ryan said. I'd just like to make two points. One is we put in the record a paper that I did with some colleagues at the Center for Information Policy Leadership about AI, how it's used today, and some of the issues it raises. And one of the things we talk about in there is the way AI is already being used to enhance privacy protections, not just to make them more easily understood or explainable, but to actually activate them. So in other words, you can identify somebody's privacy preferences as they start expressing them, and then you can start predicting what they'll be so that you offer them the default they are more likely to care about, rather than the default that you want. You try to give them the default that they want. I would say just in general, though, on the back to the original question on notice and choice, as I said earlier, we've relied on this largely because we haven't known what else to rely on for 50 years now, with not a lot to show for it. And so I think we should recognize that notice should be used, and choice, only where there's something meaningful to tell the individual, and only where there's something they can do about it. So I think it's terrific when my iPhone says, did you know this app is using your contacts? Do you want to permit that? That's meaningful notice, and I can do something. I can say yes or no. I can alter it. But making my doctor add another paragraph to the 65 paragraphs of HIPAA notice saying, by the way, your scans are going to be read by AI, and by the way, you have no choice about that whatsoever because it's far more accurate than humans, I'm not sure that's overly meaningful. I think we have to be very contextual with notice, because the effect when we don't is that we just teach people to ignore all of it. We get people in the habit of knowing that notice is meaningless, and so they don't read it. Whereas if we would use notice when there actually is something worth telling them and something they can do about it, we might resurrect notice as a meaningful data protection tool. Now, having said that, I'm not disagreeing with Irene. The law requires, both in Europe and in some industries in the United States, notice and choice. It's just bad law. And in other words, it's causing people to ignore these notices by providing them when you can't do anything about them and nobody cares. And so, one of the things we often talk about as universities is a teachable moment. You can only teach someone when they're interested in learning. Similarly, you can only give meaningful notice when there is something that's going to cause them to care about it. And that can't be they woke up in the morning or they went to a doctor's office. It might very well be where there's where there's an event, there's something happening, there's been some effect on them, there's some reason that they would care, and then using the tools that Ryan was talking about would be fabulous to really make notice meaningful and interactive.
There's always a conflict within companies with product design when you're trying to design products that's easy to use and that's easy to understand. And when you're throwing in all sorts of consents and notices, it can make it really difficult. And so there's often a conflict between the lawyers and the product design teams about how can we make it look beautiful without all your verbiage. And so that's something that we struggle with. And I completely agree with Fred that meaningful consent is ultimately more beneficial to society and to consumers for how their information is being used and how the company is using it versus just providing our lengthy privacy policies that most companies have.
And as a corollary to that, does the notion of opt-out work in an AI context, and does that vary based on, I think, the stage of the product lifecycle, be that data collection, product design, when it's rolled out to market and being used, or other instances?
Jeremy and I were talking about this earlier. So from a GDPR standpoint, you do have a right to erase your data. And so there is an obligation for companies to be able to remove that data. And depending on how you configure that information, it can be difficult. And so that's something that you need to think about from the beginning in the design phase to ensure that companies that, especially with the California Privacy Act as well, it's important to design these products in such a way that there is an opt-out notion. To opt out of AI, typically if someone wants to opt out of AI completely, that's like, let's say if I'm using Netflix and I want to opt out of using the choices that different types of videos or shows that they're showing to me, it's basically opting out of using Netflix completely. And so you have to think about, are you trying to opt out of the product, or are you trying to opt out of the database use as well? So there's different ways of viewing opt-out, and I think Jeremy can probably talk more about the technological ways of opting out.
Yeah, there's been some recent papers that show that for neural networks, you can actually reconstruct what the training data was if you're given sufficient time and access to the neural and able to, run test data through the neural network, which basically means that if I'm a service and I, used your data to train my neural network, I cannot remove the fact that the imprint your data has left on my neural network, basically without retraining it from scratch and retraining it once again without your data. So it's technically that, is it technically possible? Yes. Is that potentially a huge burden on the company? Potentially, yes. And then there's the other question of how much benefit do you get from having your imprint removed from whatever model was generated? Because it does take quite a bit of effort to reconstruct all of the training data, and so that is an unlikely but feasible attack. And so there we do have to get sort of into this balancing act a little bit.
And another question from the audience. In cases where autonomous systems result in consumer harm, who should be held liable? And to what degree?
Just send the robots to jail.
Well, I mean, I think that's a genuine puzzle. I mean, so you have in criminal law and in tort law, we generally require that you do something either on purpose or that a reasonable person would be able to foresee the category of harm that occurred, right? And so when you, for example, have a bot, which this really happened, that is supposed to buy things randomly on the web and buys methamphetamine, and the police come and say, you bought methamphetamine, and you say, no, it was the bot, right? Or in another instance where a company made a bot that was arguably hacked into, but at least was subverted by trolls that wound up denying the Holocaust, which is not lawful in some jurisdictions where that had access to this bot. I mean, you'd be sort of hard pressed to bring a criminal case to it, right? And so and certainly in many categories where just something happens where the system just behaves in a way that was not anticipated, you don't have what's called proximate causation for purpose of bringing a tort lawsuit, which is what I teach. And that's not a great place to be, because you wind up in a situation where you have victims but not perpetrators. I don't know how much that would really matter to FTC enforcement specifically, right? Because I think you could get around it just by saying, look, you created these conditions that were deceptive or unreasonable, and these unexpected things happen, but something was going to go wrong. But I think it's pretty serious in tort and criminal law. I think it's hard.
We've also had a question from the audience about retail price discrimination at the individual consumer level, and what is the material harm to the consumer in price discrimination, and maybe price discrimination cannot be sort of whether or not it's advertising different things, not on a prohibited basis under ECOA, but just because you're using a different type of computer, because you're purchasing tickets on your mobile rather than on a laptop. What is the harm? What's the cost-benefit analysis in that particular instance?
So let me say, this is a place where actually notice would be quite useful. This would be a much more, in other words, to say, if you visit this website, we're going to use pricing based on information about where you're coming from, the computer you're using, whatever, because it would then empower you to say, well, I'm going to go have my friend check and see what the price is to see if I can get a better price. In other words, that would be actionable notice. You could really do it. And by the way, having to disclose it would probably slow people down, companies down, actually wanting to do that. I mean, remember, we've discriminated on price for forever. I mean, for generations. Every time you fly, there couldn't be an environment in which there's more discrimination for all sorts of reasons, how long you're willing to stay and what night you'll stay and so forth. We discriminate based on zip code. We discriminate based on all sorts of other information that have been imperfect. Now we're going to be able to discriminate better. I mean, we're going to have both better technology and better data, and the two together are going to make much more precise discrimination. You know exactly what I'll pay. eBay knows exactly what I will pay for something because it's watched me pay that for years. And so this is actually a place where you could say, first of all, we need to figure out, is that a harm? I mean, is it something we're going to say is unfair? Is it something that we're going to say causes injury? And if not, maybe disclosure is sufficient then to say, look, we're not willing to say we're going to prohibit it, but we are going to say you get notice. And so now you can figure out if you want to try to come back at the system the other way. They're doing it to you. Can you do it to them? But this is where we have to remember, again, it's going to be very contextual, and it's not something new. It's not something AI is going to create. AI is going to make it better in the sense of potentially more precise or more tailored.
I'll give you my two favorite examples of price discrimination and by favorite, I don't mean I like them. One of them was a couple of years ago, a marketing firm was using this tool to figure out when women felt worse about themselves, and they labeled these prime vulnerability moments, and they suggested that perhaps you should advertise or charge people more during those moments. You know what I mean? That strikes me as not a very good use of price discrimination. Another one of my favorites, although they claim they never did this, is when Uber experimented with figuring out whether you'd be more willing to pay surge prices when your battery was low on your phone, because maybe you'd get stranded there. Lovely also. They say they never done this, and I believe them about that. The issue is not price discrimination. The issue is taking advantage of people, which happens. It happens a lot. Right, and yes, from an economic perspective, better information is better. Maybe we would worry at one level about all the social surplus going to the firm. They know your reservation price. There's no windfall for you because they charge you more if you would be willing to pay more, so they get the social surplus. We've seemed to have moved away from the original understanding of how consumer protection worked, which was that it was amoral for firms to extricate all of the social. We seem to have moved away from that model, and that's fine. But I think it's the advantage taking that I really would worry about, and that's the kind of thing I want there to be hard questions asked about.
Yeah, but what I think is that the questions we're addressing here, like from the liability question and answer from a tort perspective to this question right now, is that there are no new issues. Price discrimination has existed forever, and it doesn't matter whether a machine makes the decision or not. The debate is the debate, and we should analyze whether price discrimination, for example, is pro-competitive or not, or on the other side, whether consumers are being harmed or not, and which approach we want to take. But it's a debate that we should be having, and we've been having, even without machines. So I think we just need to continue talking about these things, but I don't think it makes a difference whether a machine makes a decision or a human being makes that decision.
So I actually want to disagree. There's something fundamentally different, and if you lump in AI and big data, then and predictive analytics altogether, then I agree there's nothing new separate on AI. But a major difference is that now you're making a decision based on a tremendous amount of data that has been collected, as opposed to just say one data point that you happen to notice, or the one data point you got, like the zip code, or how many nights you want to stay for the flight, or something like that. Something that is very clear. Now you can potentially make price discrimination decisions based on what websites the person was visiting. Were they looking at budget travel websites versus high-end travel websites? And then there's the question of what happens how are the price discrimination decisions made if you don't have any data on the person? And do they suffer a penalty for preserving their privacy? If I use a tracker blocker app on my phone and I go to your website and I try to buy a plane ticket and you don't have any history, am I automatically categorized as I have to pay the highest price or not, as a punishment for not giving you data about what level I might be willing to pay? So I think that is a difference, as opposed to, say, what we've been doing for generations. It's not different versus what we've been doing for, the last 10 or 15 years.
Following up on that, though, even though these are problems that we faced before, are there any particular harms that are new based on price discrimination from AI, or that is a result of AI? Any new types of harms, or is this just the same thing that we've seen before?
Well, I think there's a huge difference. I mean, I think that, and again, I do think you have to group together a bunch of different phenomena. It's not AI particularly, but look. For a long time, companies have noticed that, and not just companies, like mom and pop shops, everybody's noticed that there are just cognitive limitations that we all have, right? We just have these limitations to our rationality, and that's why everything costs $9.99, right? I mean, obviously, okay? And there is a set of cognitive limitations that behavioral law and economists, Ariely, Kahneman, and so on have, Christy Joels at Yale, have been surfacing over a long period of time. And these are things like, prospect theory and status quo bias. And sometimes the FTC actually intervenes and says, well, you seem to be using status quo bias here with these rebates. We're going to intervene because it doesn't seem to be fair, and you don't seem to understand what's going on. The issue is that even with all these behavioral economists thinking about how we have cognitive limitations, their list of cognitive limitations is about 45 long, okay? What artificial intelligence permits you to do, because it's so good at pattern matching, is to model what rational consumer behavior would look like in a particular environment, and then look for deviations that are particular to you, even if they're not explicable. Turns out when you're watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer on Tuesday night, you're going to pay more for ice cream. I know I am. But the point of the matter is that there will be situations that are very, very specific to you, and perhaps not even have a theory behind them. But what it allows is the mass production of bias. That's what it allows. It allows these systems to figure out where you are specifically susceptible. And indeed, we see early signs of this already. I mean, you heard earlier from a presentation about how Netflix is showing different people posters for shows based on guesses about their demographics or their qualities. That is part of a phenomenon that in the literature is referred to as persuasion profiling. The idea that not just that you be matched to your interests, but that the messages to you to sell you things would be matched to your unique vulnerability. So if, for example, for some reason in your life you are really worried about scarcity, well, that advertisement will say, while supplies last, right? And this is the kind of move that marketers are making, and it is only possible because of the way that we're mediated by digital technology, and we have these intense analytic capabilities. And respectfully, I think that is an enormous distinction from what has come before.
So obviously, before we didn't have self-driving cars, and now apparently we're going to have self-driving cars. So we're going to see new things happening. Now a self-driving car might just cross over a person. But the point that I was trying to make is that the thought process of analyzing the problems and analyzing who is at fault, what's the causality. I mean, the thought process is the same that exists without human beings. It's just applied to the new setting. And I think the theories and the thought process should remain, and we shouldn't think in the abstract. We should think like we have a lot of analysis in tort law, for example, and we want to say who's responsible, who's not. In a self-driving car, there is software, hardware, there are apps. There might be somebody inside the car that was doing something as well. And what I mean is that when we are analyzing who is at fault and who's liable for crossing over to people, the thought process of, for example, causality should be the same as without AI. That's an example, for example, of the point that I was trying to make.
So I'm going to ask one final question, and then I think we're going to wrap up. It's going to be a compound question, so because I like that. Are there ways in which the FTC should expand or rethink the notions of unfairness and deception when it comes to AI? And what educational role should the FTC play with these new technologies, both for consumers and businesses? And Marianela, do you want to start?
I think it's a very good final question. I think the FTC is doing a great job in putting together these hearings. I said it in the beginning. I think AI is just a machine learning. It's at a nascent moment. I think it's very important to keep having a dialogue with businesses, with the community, with the consumers, with experts, and see where we're going to, and see whether there's anything that needs to be refined, for example, of the existing laws or not. But what is very, very important is not to think in the abstract of AI. We talk about AI as if, at this moment, there are marvelous things that can be done. I think there's a lot of potential, but I really think that before stepping and regulating or saying, oh, it's going to be a disaster, everything is going to be mass biased, etc., we really need to understand where we stand, what engineers can do, what companies are working on. I think companies, at least the ones that CCI represents, are willing to cooperate with the authorities, are willing to engage in adopting principles, and I think having an open and frank dialogue about what's going on is key to make sure we get the right approach so society can really profit from AI.
Irene, you just want to continue down the line?
Sure. I again, from the beginning, I feel that the FTC framework and the existing laws are sufficient, and the fact that it's broad enough that it can capture AI is, I think that's great. And I think FTC Act has withstood the test of time because it is broad. And so, but at the same time, I do think, I agree with Mariella that it's important for the FTC to continue talking to the industry, also with other regulators and academics to make sure that they're abreast of this nascent technology. There's also movements across the globe. It's not just a U.S. phenomenon, but just globally. Again, there's a recent universal guideline for AIs that was launched in 2018 by a number of data protection officers recently. The World Economic Forum is working on this issue. Regulators in Europe, China has taken a deep interest in AI, and so there's a lot of cross-country developments within AI as well that the FTC can also engage in to make sure that it stays ahead in terms of the policy developments around the world, so that we're not hindering innovation but fostering it as well. So from that perspective, I think the FTC Act is moving in the right direction with these types of hearings as well. From an education standpoint, the FTC can also play a role in educating consumers to understand what is AI. Again, because it is a new technology, people hear about it. We talk about it all the time in Silicon Valley, but it may not be known to the rest of the country. So just educating people about what chatbots are, what it means when you're choosing Netflix on a Tuesday night and listening to and watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, what the impact that might be. It might be that your ice cream prices might go up, or it may be that your Netflix fee might go up if you are a more avid watcher than others. So just understanding the impact of the data would be helpful to consumers, and also encouraging companies to implement AI, not just to exploit data, but to think about it holistically is really important, and encouraging companies to do that from that framework of advancing society versus exploiting data is something that FTC can take on too.
So I'm actually going to answer the question in reverse order. In terms of consumer education, I think to accomplish that mission, the FTC needs a much more robust staff of technologists. They've only somewhat recently started having technologists on staff. I feel like the FTC should have as many technologists as lawyers at this point. And obviously that is not where we are. So then I also realize that is not in the FTC's ability to change. So if you are a congressman or a congresswoman sitting in the audience, this is my plea to you, is increase the funding for technologists at the FTC. Because those technologists can help with explaining AI and what to expect in a consumer standpoint to consumers. They can also help explain it to the lawyers at the FTC when they are doing enforcement actions or they're doing investigations. They can help explain it to policymakers. So I think there's a real need for a really robust technical staff there. In terms of the whether or not the FTC Act sufficiently captures everything that we might worry about with regards to AI, I still worry a little bit about the fact that, I mean, I guess the two parts. One is whether, I mean, at least, and again, this is, you've got the only non-lawyer, I think, on the panel talking. The FTC Act, when you're talking about harms and unfair and deceptive, you're talking about what is the cost-benefit analysis. And I worry a little bit that when we're talking about privacy in particular, and so again, this comes back to rolling AI and big data and predictive analytics into the same thing. But when you're talking about privacy, what may be good for society isn't necessarily good for the most vulnerable part of the population. Because privacy is really about privilege. It's, you know, I'm a cis white guy, middle class, like I'm boring. Like you could know everything about me and it doesn't matter because I'm not worried about something happening to me. But for many people with very different demographics, they are very worried about what data gets out about them. And so while, you know, on average, when we're making that sort of cost-benefit analysis about what works for society, that may make sense. But when we're talking about privacy, we really need to be thinking about what works for the most vulnerable part of the population.
So I think the FTC has enormous capacity under Section 5 and FCRA and so forth. And as Ryan was saying earlier, I think it should be asking the hard questions and flexing those muscles. Having said that, I actually do think additional legal authority is likely to be necessary. And some of that may be based more on what we might call procedure, but in terms of ways that companies go about making decisions and documenting those decisions, about the use of data-based automated decision-making that affects individuals in significant ways. And then I don't think there's actually a shortage of information. I think we have too much information right now about AI, and that one role that the Commission might very productively play, as it's doing now, is helping to sort of sort through some of that information. I mean, everyone on Earth now has got a code on AI. They all start with fairness. I have no idea what fairness means, not the first idea. And so helping to, for example, as you've begun today, thinking through what is fairness, what are the elements of fairness, how do you measure it, what's a desirable goal. The same thing about harms. I don't think we have any agreement at all about what are harms. I mean, we know the extreme of harms. If someone's physically injured or they lose money, that's a harm. But what about between where we are and there? And so in this area, I think the FTC has an enormously important role to play, and frankly, a great deal of experience to draw on in trying to kind of sort through all of the stuff that is out there and emerging, and try to help make sense of it for individuals and for businesses alike.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of healthy back and forth and disagreement about certain things on this panel, but I think that you're seeing a rough consensus that the Federal Trade Commission is well suited, both because of its expertise and because of its century of protecting American consumers. I think we need an FTC that is very assertive and uses the full range of its powers and pushes the definition, of unfairness and deception, and updates it for a contemporary context, right? That's what's so beautiful about a standard, is that it can be updated. And if these new technologies are as powerful as people claim, so powerful that we need to get out of their way, then they're also the kind of thing that require a change to law and legal institutions. And so, my hope too is for, I don't know that there's any additional authority really needed. I just think that the Federal Trade Commission should be emboldened to pursue these very assertively, and that Congress and the court should let them do their job.
Well, with that, I want to thank our panelists and our audience for an exciting discussion. I want to remind everyone that to come back for day 2 tomorrow for more interesting insights. And thank you all for participating in this process. Thank you.